didn't believe that it was at its best in this deck.
No, I mean, I'm not an aggro deck, so the bonus of +2/+2 and lifelink and trample isn't that strong in my deck. All of those things lend yourself to attacking so you can gain the life and win races.
Sure.
And I'm not really trying to race. I still thought it was worth including because I don't have that many spells, and you know, the life gain does help me stay alive. But I don't feel like it's nearly as good in this deck as it would be in a deck that's primary plan was to kill the opponent by damage, by racing.
So to tie this together with Booster Draft, since once release comes out, we're going to see a lot of people playing a Magic Gathering online, a lot of people coming to their local stores and doing an 8-man draft. What can we extrapolate from these lessons for 8-man draft? For example, if you were to draft this style of deck in an 8-man draft, would you ever consider cutting this card?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's definitely cuttable. I mean, this is probably a very good card that you're going to take pretty aggressively in a lot of decks. But in a deck like this, you know, if I could switch it out for another Sunfire Griffin if my mana was a little bit better, or another 2-drop that would be good in my deck or something, I would. It really doesn't fit what the deck is trying to do very well.
Moving on from this deck in particular, were there any lessons that you gleaned from playing this deck, the interaction specifically, or perhaps anything that your opponents were doing that we can apply to Booster Draft? Because here we are on Sunday, still during the pre-release. You're heralded as one of, if not the best limited players on the planet. What can you offer people for advice that related to this deck or the matches you played with it that they can apply to Booster Draft on Friday when it's released?
Okay, Booster Draft tends to be a little bit faster, and falling behind tends to be an even bigger problem.
Sure.
So styles like this tend to be better in sealed than in draft.
But perhaps some of those specific interactions or things you saw your opponents doing gave you some ideas on pick orders or cards to watch out for or anything of that sort?
I wouldn't want to delve too deep into pick orders at this point.
That would be rather ambitious, but just maybe some cards that you noticed in play and you said, wow, that's better than it looked on the sport.
Okay, I mean, I kind of have the reverse of that with the clue stones. I don't think they're going to be particularly good in Booster Draft, as I already mentioned.
Well, that's equally valuable. Anything that's worse than the norm anticipation. Sure.
As far as better, I was pretty impressed with a lot of the earlier drops and with the 2/4s.
That's been a question on a lot of people's minds, especially mine. I know we've had discussions on how many gates we're going to need to activate them reliably on turn 4. Which one is best? Is the standard deck going to want to use these? Is the defensive application going to be relevant? Tell us anything you can about that.
Right. I feel like there's a significant portion of aggro decks in this format. Gatecrash was very aggressive, and Return had some aggro decks with Rakdos and Izzet. And so I feel, and sometimes even Celestia Populate isn't really that aggro, but sometimes people draft Celestia with more pump spells and less Populate.
Right.
So I feel like...
Two distinct archetypes.
Right. So I feel like the cycle of 2/4s are going to be quite good. You don't need them on every time. It's not like it's a requirement to cast a card that you have 2 gates in play. They're single color casting cost, 4 drops, 2/4s. So I feel like they're going to be a lot better in Booster Draft than in Sealed, because in Sealed, a lot of times you don't really care that much about putting a 2/2, gaining life, things like that. In Booster Draft, that's going to those cards are just going to stifle aggression. I mean, if your plan is 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, and your opponent maybe puts out a mediocre 2 or 3, so you're getting a little ahead, and then on turn 4 or 5, they put out a 2/4 that gains 7 life, kills one of your creatures, you know, puts a 2/2 into play and a 2/4. I mean, your aggression on the ground is going to be in trouble. It's going to be very difficult.
So we were talking a bit about the threshold of gates. How many gates do you feel you're going to need to have per 2/4 that you have in your deck? Now, you don't always have to cast them on turn 4, and that's something we've discussed, and the 2/4 body alone is valuable. But what's your comfortable number from what you've observed so far?
From what I've observed so far, if I want to have them go off a decent percentage of the time, I'm going to be looking at 4 or 5, like minimum. Obviously, if you only have 2 gates, you're almost never going to have 2 of 2. If you have 3, you're still almost never going to have 2 of 3 on turn 4. But if you can get to that, 4, 5, 6 range, you should be able to trigger them, the majority of the time.
Gotcha. And to kind of tie some things together, so we've discussed Sion and Tesa and Ready Willing as some very powerful cards from the new set. Just give us a few final words on how you would rate these cards in Booster Draft. I realize you don't have precise opinions yet.
No, sure. I think Ready and Willing is going to be a 10 in Booster Draft, just like in Sealed.
Oh wow, like a full 10 out of 10.
It's an incredible card.
So if you're able to use both modes for that fuse, you are going to take that over any other card. Yeah.
The fact that it's a split card and both of the abilities on their own aren't broken but are playable is really nice, much like Mizium Mortars.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. Mizium Mortars, if you were playing for 6 with the Overload, it was a game-winning bomb, a 10. If you were only playing it for 2, it's still good. Nothing
It's still a very first pickable card, solid removal spell.
Right, and this card, obviously, if you're playing just Redding or just Willing, it might be worse than Mizium Mortars on kick.
Sure.
But, you know, Redding's pretty good. If you're sitting here stuck on 3 and you're just deploying 2 and 3 drops, you know, you're going to attack them and they attack, you might cast Ready, untap your guys with Indestructible and kill 2 creatures for 3 mana.
Sure.
I mean, it's pretty good. Ready and Willing, when you combine them, is nigh unbeatable. If you've got out 3-4 creatures and you just start attacking them, what are they going to do? Take all your guys and then not attack you back?
We observed exactly that on the stream. You know, I try to put myself in your opponent's positions and ask myself, okay, let's say I was more familiar with the format and I anticipated Ready Willing as a potential card you might have here, because a lot of the time you had it, it was easier for me, of course, because I knew you had it in your deck, but your plays lined up with it directly.
I was actually worried about that myself. When I was starting to think about what to attack with, I realized that it was going to be kind of telegraphed. But then I was like, what are they going to do?
Right. We had the exact same thought process there. Sure, you know, you could turn it face up and it's still almost like, what are their options?
Yeah. I mean, the best thing you can do to play against it is obviously block like 1 creature or 2 creatures, but I mean, you're going to get blown out. You know,
Right.
if you only block 1, they just don't cast it, and you took a bunch of damage to play another guy. If you block 2 or 3, I mean, it's a huge blowout. So I mean, it really just, it does it all. I mean, I almost wish it like gave it Indestructible and Lifelink and not Death Touch or something, because there's just no blocks you're going to make against Ready and Willing.
So how about Tesa for draft?
Tesa's not going to be as good in draft. 7 mana cards just aren't that good in relatively fast draft formats.
Can you give us any sort of range as to where you put it? I know that's difficult, but compare it to, say, a mid-range creature that you always play, decent removal spell. How would you compare it to?
I can't imagine I would ever take it over a Kingpin's Pet. I know they're not in the same set.
Right. Well, sure. I still think, yeah, that still illustrates the point.
For perspective, I mean, I think it might be playable if the format slows down in draft. It might be not even playable in a lot of draft.
Wow. See, I think that information is going to be fascinating to a lot of our audience, especially considering what the buzz that Tesa created. I imagine that would be a rare pick among our audience.
I feel like Tesa's a sealed deck card.
Okay.
I feel like in sealed, it is pretty good because the games, people have a lot of removal and games get kind of grimy and you just get to turn 7 and, you know, people haven't been able to cast 1 or 2 of their cards because they're splashing them. In draft, decks tend to be pretty focused. People tend to apply a lot of pressure, and 7 drops usually need to impact the board they come into play, or like kill all your opponent's creatures, some of your opponent's creatures, things like that.
See, I find that fascinating because most of our competitive or aspiring competitive players, sure, they understand there's a difference between sealed and draft, and they understand sealed slows it down, but they would not imagine that a card that can be a bomb and sealed could go all the way to unplayable in draft. Realizing just how wide that disparity is fascinating.
Right. I mean, I don't know how much Dragon's Maze is going to slow down the format, and I don't know whether it's going to be like, you know, good but not great, playable but not good, unplayable. But I do know that it's going to go down a lot from sealed to draft. Not a lot of it, you know, quite a bit. I mean, when I picture the current black-white decks, the Orzhov decks from Gatecrash, they don't want Tesa. They just have no desire to have a Tesa in their deck.
That makes sense, especially with trying to trigger Extort. The more expensive spells you play, the less synergistic that's going to be.
Right, and so, I mean, there's a huge, and they only play 17 lands, and they don't have any card drawing, so I mean, in those decks, they don't want Tesa. Now, there's only going to be 1 pack of Gatecrash, still with the same cards. Right. So I really have no idea what the black-white decks are going to look like yet, you know, in a full Return to Ravnica block draft.
Of course.
But
well, you've talked about how you're not a magician, other than the literal sense as we're sitting here gaming. But
right. So far I've played 2 sealed decks, and I've read the spoiler, and I have the same exposure everybody else who got to enjoy the pre-release has. But in my estimation, Tesa will not be very good in draft.
So talk to us a little bit about Sion of Vitu-Ghazi. I know that we had a conversation, either on stream or perhaps in private, where I thought maybe that's even a constructed quality card. Now, I know creatures are a lot better than we're used to. In our days, we probably played some cards at Pro Tours that were worse than Sion of Vitu-Ghazi, but these days you expect a lot out of a creature.
I can see it. I can see it being a constructed card. I mean, obviously, unless you're using the tokens, probably not a modern card, but I could definitely see it like a block, possibly type 2 card. It's similar to Geist on Monk, which saw a lot of constructed play.
Right.
And it's also a lot better casted at 5. I think Sion, for example, is going to be excellent in booster draft, like a first pick. Not a 10 like Ready and Willing, but you know, like 8 to 9, like a very good first pick.
So what type of cards would you be willing to take over Sion? I suppose obviously if somehow it's in the same pack as Ready Willing with a foil, then you would take Ready Willing.
I would take Ready Willing.
Is this a card you're going to consistently take over a removal spell or a cheaper quality creature?
Yes, Sion is an excellent card for booster draft. It's going to give you, if you're behind, it's going to give you 2 to 3 creatures when you play it, so you're going to be able to catch back up. If your opponent has removal, you're still going to get the advantage. And booster draft is a lot less about going over the top than sealed is, so like the 4/4 body is going to be a lot better on turn 6 and 7 in booster draft than it is in sealed deck on turn 6 and 7.
Makes sense. Well, Ben, any closing thoughts on your experience here or the pre-release or anything you'd like to share?
It was a lot of fun. I'm really glad I didn't expect to get Orzhov. I was pretty happy, and especially when I get ready and willing, and then I get to play green, white, splash, black. It just kind of came together nicely.
Okay. Well, Ben, thank you. We've enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Look forward to our next video. Thanks, guys.